Imagine waking up at 2 in the morning to the sound of your neighbor screaming, and then silence. You look out the window and see nothing but darkness. By the time the sun rises, 55 people in your county are dead. The governor of Virginia is writing panic letters to Washington begging for soldiers, and the man responsible has vanished into the woods like a ghost. This wasn't a foreign invasion. This wasn't an army. This was one man, one enslaved man who had been told his entire life that he was property, and who decided in the summer of 1831 that he would rather die free than spend one more day in chains. His name was Nat Turner, and what he did in the next 48 hours didn't just kill people. It cracked the foundation of the most powerful slave economy in the Western world and forced the United States government to confront a truth it had been desperately trying to ignore, that the millions of people it had enslaved were not broken. They were waiting. To understand Nat Turner, you need to understand the world he was born into, because it was a world designed from the very first breath to destroy him. He was born in 1800 on a plantation in Southampton County, Virginia. His mother, Nancy, was an African woman who had been kidnapped so recently from her homeland that she still remembered her name in her native language. She was so devastated by the idea of her son growing up enslaved that, according to accounts from people who were there, she had to be physically restrained from killing him at birth. Not because she didn't love him, because she loved him too much to watch what was coming. Think about that for a moment. Think about what level of despair brings a mother to that place, and then understand that this was not an unusual sentiment. This was the world. This was the baseline. This was what Nat Turner opened his eyes to on the first day of his life. From the very beginning, people around him knew he was different. He learned to read before anyone taught him, which was not just unusual, it was illegal. In most southern states, teaching an enslaved person to read was a criminal offense because literacy meant access to ideas, and ideas were the one thing the entire system of slavery could not survive. Nat Turner read anyway. He read obsessively, and he read one book above all others, the Bible. And in that book, which the people who enslaved him had given him specifically to make him docile and obedient, he found something that changed everything. He found Moses. He found Exodus. He found the story of a people held in bondage by a powerful empire and a man chosen by God to lead them out. And Nat Turner became absolutely, unshakably convinced that he was that man. For years he waited, he prayed, he fasted for days at a time, he watched the sky for signs. The people around him on the plantation knew he was spiritually intense in a way that went beyond ordinary faith. He would go into trances, speak in visions, describe things he said God had shown him. His slave owner, Joseph Travis, considered him harmless, eccentric maybe, but harmless. That was the first of many catastrophic miscalculations. Then in February 1831, there was a solar eclipse. To Nat Turner, this was not an astronomical event. This was God speaking directly to him. This was the signal he had been waiting for his entire life. He gathered a small group of men he trusted, other enslaved people on neighboring plantations, men he had been quietly, carefully talking to for months, and he began to plan. And what is striking about that plan, what the historical record shows clearly and what his captors could never quite reconcile with their image of an enslaved man, is how tactically intelligent it was. He wasn't acting on impulse. He wasn't lashing out in rage. He was thinking several moves ahead.
The plan was this: start at the plantation of Joseph Travis, the man who owned him. Kill every white person in that house. Then move to the next plantation, and the next, killing slaveholders and gathering more recruits as they went, building momentum like a snowball rolling downhill until they had enough men to march on the county seat of Jerusalem, Virginia, seize the armory, and trigger a full-scale uprising across the entire region. He knew the odds were against him. He knew what would happen if they failed. He planned anyway because to Nat Turner the question was never about the odds. The question was whether any human being had the right to own another. And the answer he had arrived at was one that no amount of violence could change.
On the night of August 21st, 1831, Nat Turner and 6 men gathered in the woods. They drank cider, they talked, they prayed together in the dark. And then just before 2 in the morning, they walked toward the house of Joseph Travis. What happened next was brutal and swift. The Travis family was killed in their beds before any of them had time to understand what was happening. And then they moved to the next house, and the next. By dawn, they were over 40 people moving through Southampton County with guns taken from the plantations they had attacked, horses, and the kind of momentum that fear cannot stop once it starts. They moved faster than news of them could travel. Families were killed before they even knew to be afraid. By midday, they had killed 55 people and were approaching the town of Jerusalem, the county seat where the armory was. They were close. They were so close that the history of the United States could have turned in an entirely different direction in the next 2 hours. And then something happened. The historical accounts are not completely clear on what exactly fractured the plan at that moment. Some say they stopped at a plantation to recruit more men and lost critical time. Others say there was disagreement about whether to push forward, but whatever the reason, the delay was fatal. A group of white militiamen intercepted them before they reached the town, and in the firefight that followed, Nat Turner's rebellion was broken. His men scattered. Most were captured within days. Nat Turner himself disappeared. And for the next 6 weeks, while the entire state of Virginia descended into a collective panic that bordered on psychosis, he was nowhere to be found. The governor mobilized the militia. The federal government sent soldiers. White families abandoned their farms and fled to the cities. Armed groups roamed the countryside at night. And in that fear and rage, those armed groups did something that the historical record is very clear about and very uncomfortable with. They murdered over 200 enslaved people who had absolutely nothing to do with the rebellion. 200 people killed in reprisal. People who had been working in fields, sleeping in cabins, living their lives, killed because they were black, because they were enslaved, and because the people doing the killing were too terrified and too enraged to think straight. Nat Turner was finally captured on October 30th, hiding in a hole he had dug under a pile of fence rails not far from the Travis plantation. People who were there described him as completely calm when they found him, not defeated, not broken, calm. Like a man who had already settled his accounts with the universe and had nothing left to fear. He was taken to Jerusalem, Virginia, the very town he had been marching toward, and held in a jail cell where a lawyer named Thomas Gray spent several days interviewing him before his trial. What Gray wrote down from those conversations became one of the most remarkable documents in American history, the Confessions of Nat Turner. In it, Turner speaks with absolute clarity and zero apology. He describes his visions in detail. He describes his certainty that God commanded him to act. He describes the planning, the execution, the moment things fell apart. He does not express regret. He does not beg for mercy. And at the end of the interviews, when Gray asks him directly, given everything that has happened, the failure, the capture, the death sentence that is obviously coming, does he feel he was wrong? Nat Turner looked at him and said, "Was not Christ crucified?" He was convicted and sentenced to death. He was hanged on November 11th, 1831. And then the authorities, in a final act that tells you everything about how much he frightened them, desecrated his body, skinned it, beheaded it, cut it into pieces, in a deliberate attempt to erase him. To make an example, to say to every enslaved person in Virginia, "Look what we do to people like this. Do not even think about it." What they could not have anticipated is what happened next. Because Nat Turner's rebellion did not end slavery, it did not even slow it down in the short term. In fact, in the immediate aftermath, Virginia passed some of the harshest anti-literacy laws in American history, making it even more illegal to teach enslaved people to read, cutting off what little access to education they had. By every conventional measure, the rebellion failed, and yet, what Nat Turner did was shatter a lie. The lie that enslaved people were content, the lie that they had accepted their condition, the lie that the system was stable. Every slaveholder in the South had to go to sleep after August 1831 knowing something they had been pretending wasn't true, that the people they owned were not property. They were human beings who were aware of exactly what was being done to them, who were capable of organizing, planning, and acting, and who had every reason in the world to do so. That knowledge changed the psychology of slavery in America permanently. The paranoia, the increasingly brutal restrictions, the desperate pro-slavery arguments that consumed Southern politics for the next 30 years, all of it traces back to one night in Southampton County when a preacher with a Bible and 6 men with axes proved that the foundation of an entire civilization was standing on sand. Nat Turner was 31 years old when they killed him. He had spent his entire life as property. He died having proven beyond any argument that he was never that, and in the whispers of enslaved people across the South in the years that followed, his name was not a warning, it was a promise. The history you were taught in school was edited, curated. Stories like this one were considered too dangerous, too complicated, too human to fit neatly into a textbook. This channel exists to find them, the ones that were buried, the ones that were sanitized, the ones that someone decided you didn't need to know. If that's the kind of history you want, subscribe, because next week we're going to talk about something that will make tonight's story look like a warm-up act.